Welcome everybody. My name's Berit Johannessen and I am a solutions engineer here at iFormBuilder. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. Elahe and I really appreciate it, as well as other people on our team. Before we really get started, I just wanted to share with you one of the, that we do have an upcoming release coming out. And if you don't follow our release notes yet, I strongly suggest that you do. With this release, we have a couple really neat updates. And the first two that I'm going to mention go along with the Android and iOS platform. So we're going to allow you to do something called a subform batch mode. What that will allow you to do is create subform records with less clicking. So right now, when you have your users out in the field and they're maybe taking tons and tons of pictures for a subform. And then every time they take a picture, it brings them back to that main screen. What this will allow you to do is allow them to continually take pictures without going back to that parent form or that main screen. So that's really neat that that's coming out. But we also have done a database enhancement so that users with large amounts of data, you should notice a big difference with the upload and download speed. And moving on, we also have a server update, which will allow for the range widget enhancement. So currently, when you go into the admin tool and you go into the data tab, and maybe you want to edit some of your data, the range widget wasn't working the best way that it could. And so we've made an update for that, as well as some other miscellaneous fixes and enhancements. And so those are just some of the, I guess, what you want to say, the beginning of our session. Before we even go anywhere with the topic that you're here to listen to, I wanted to make sure we covered that. For those of you who are brand new to these training webinar sessions, we do record these sessions as well as allow you to have access to this PDF. So while I go through some of this material, you'll notice it says like click here to read release notes. These are going to be clickable. And when you download the PDF and look at it, it'll bring you to very, very helpful articles based off of those topics, or for this instance, the next release that we're having. So let's jump into today's training. What is it that you're really here to do? This is our main focus for today's session, is to try to help you learn how to cut down on data cleansing and then make the data input easier for your field users. So all of the things that we're going to do in today's session are focused around those two main things. There's no point in really spending all this time going through data that you've already collected, just cleansing it or changing it a little bit, when you can set up a form to have the format of the data that you need. To start, we're going to go through best practices for form building. The first one here is that I strongly suggest to use a naming convention for all forms. So what you'll see later on when I show my FormBuilder account, you'll notice that I've used the naming convention to have the parent form with _P and any subform or child form with _C, but always starting with the parent form. That way in my FormBuilder, it's a lot easier to find and it's a lot more organized. Another best practice here is to clean the local database in the iForm app if something doesn't look quite right. This is especially important once you start using the smart controls and the JavaScript. Even today, I noticed that one of the functions wasn't working properly and I had to clean the local database. If you're unsure of where that button is, it's on the same login and log out screen within the iForm app. The next best practice that we have is to always test on all device types before going live. This is especially important if you're using both an Android and an iOS device, or if your users have access to either one. The reason for that being is now we're trying to have our Android platform be as strong as our iOS, because we did start with the iOS, but they are two completely different platforms. And so some of the functionalities may look a little bit different or act a little bit different. And so that is why it's really important to make sure that you've tested on both types, but also the smallest device that you're going to use. You should make sure you always test on the smallest one, because especially if you're using the option list that is a select option list, the text might run together. So if it looks a little bit too long, or if it looks like it fits on the iPad, you may want to test on on a smaller device to see if the text is running together at all. The next one that I have here is to open multiple browser tabs for convenience. Now you'll even notice once I bring mine over here, if you can see my screen, I have about 4 different iFormBuilder tabs open currently, and those are all connected to this parent form. So I have the subform here, another subform here, and then another form altogether. Oops. And then the next step that I have here is to add a required field, all the required fields once a form is complete. So when you're setting up your form, and if you're in the input properties, you'll notice that you have the option to check off this box that says required. My personal preference is to wait until I'm completely done setting up my form, and at that point I'll make all the fields required that need to be. The reason I personally prefer that method is it allows me to test the data and view the data before going live. The next point I want to give you is that remember that only the parent form needs to be assigned. So when you're building a form, all the forms are always going to be assigned to you. Now you may not want that, and so you'll have to go under Form Assignment and unassign any forms that have been assigned to you just because you are the creator. But also when you are assigning your forms to your users, just assign that top level of the form. Our next best practice here is to always follow the iFormBuilder golden rules. And I'm going to go through those with you in just one moment. Moving forward, another best practice that I strongly suggest using is the reference IDs. So when you're building a form and the first step, you notice you're in a window that you have to put in the name of your form and the description and choose an icon. Well, on that same page, there's an area that says reference IDs. So there's reference IDs 1 through 5. Each one of those can allow you to do all these different functionalities within your form and specific to your workflow. So I have a link to those reference IDs, and I'll share that with you too. But I strongly suggest if you're not using those yet to look into what those reference IDs are. And going on to our form building golden rules. If you don't hear anything today, except this, I will be okay. These are some of the most important things to remember when you're building your forms, not only when you're building them, but also when you're editing and changing them. The first one here is to always test your form before going live. So the worst thing in the world is you spend all this time building a form, and then maybe you make 1 or 2 changes and you don't test it, and then you send it out to all your users. Once they're out there, nothing works. Maybe there's just one little snippet of your JavaScript code that just doesn't work. So this is why you have to make sure you always test before sending it out to all your users. The second form building golden rule that we have listed here is to make sure that you use unique data column names. Now this is a form building golden rule, but it's also, if you don't follow and you don't have a unique data column name, you won't be able to save your form. Now probably some of you have run into this problem. I personally have run into this problem, and it gets to be a little bit annoying. You get this error message that looks something like this, where it says data column name location is not allowed. And at that point, you can't save your form, you have to refresh your window. And so this is why we've included it as our form building golden rule, so you don't have to go through that process. We have a list of reserved words. These words are everything that's not acceptable as a data column name. Keep in mind though, the label and the data column name are 2 separate entities. So your label can be a term that's not database friendly, but your data column name has to be unique in that way. And then the third one, do not change the input type, data size, or encryption of an element on a live form because it will delete the data. That is super, super important to remember, and especially if you are somebody who loves the fact that you are able to change a form at any time, even during the live data collection process. You need to make sure that you don't do any of these things or you don't change the input type, data size, or encryption, or it will delete the data. So instead of changing those in a live form, what you'll do is you'll disable the element that you want to change those things for and create a new element underneath. And once you do that, any change that you take place will be fine. Ella, hey, do we have any questions? And can you hear me a little bit better now?
We don't have any questions, and yeah, it's breaking up less, but still from time to time, it's there's a little bit of a break time.
All right, well, thank you. I think it's the Wi-Fi connection, so hopefully it gets a little bit better. Before we go into what the smart controls are, before I actually show you what they are, I want to tell you a little bit about them. So what are smart controls? Basically, you're able to add functionality to a form. So it's no longer a one-dimensional form like your paper form is. It also uses basic JavaScript to add actions to different elements. Now, if you're on this call and you're thinking, well, I have no idea how to write JavaScript, do not worry. We have an amazing help desk agents that are always on chat, as well as help desk articles that walk through how to create the functionality that you want. So we're here to help you with that if that word JavaScript kind of scares you. Now, going forward, why should you use these smart controls? Number one, cuts down on human interaction with the form. So the user's able to complete more records in a day than if they didn't have the smart controls. Number two, you're able to define what a user sees based off of their selections. And number three, you cut down on human error. So that's that data cleansing that I was talking about earlier. I have some links here that are great JavaScript tools. This first one, W3 Schools, I find extremely helpful. And so if you've never used JavaScript, you start using it and you find that you really like it, W3 Schools is a great way to learn more about it. All right, within the form builder, for each element that you have, you'll notice there's a section called Smart Controls. And this is where the magic happens. There's a couple different options that you have for the smart controls. You have the dynamic value, you have condition value, dynamic label, client validation, and validation message. So here's a brief description on each one. The way that I usually think about it is for the dynamic value, if you're trying to default an element or if you're trying to make any kind of action happen for that element, then you'll want to use the dynamic value. The condition value is used when you're worried about the view of that specific element. So for instance, if you don't want a text area to show unless a specific selection is made in a pick list, then you'll place that JavaScript within the condition value. The dynamic label allows you to change a label of a specific field based off of a user's input earlier in the form. Now, client validation and validation message, those two go hand in hand. The client validation is you're able to create a JavaScript statement that restricts a record from being uploaded to the cloud based off of a criteria that you place. The validation message will show up if the user doesn't pass that criteria that you've placed. So what can they do? They can show or hide elements based on a user's input. They default elements. You can do mathematical calculations. You can validate a user input, concatenate multiple elements into one element, barcode scanning, parse location data, subform aggregation, integrate with third-party apps and URL schemes, and so much more. There's just tons that you can do. So before we go any further, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a form that I created just a little bit ago to show you some of these smart controls. So to start, you can notice that I've used some of the reference IDs and I've been able to add different colors to the different forms. This way, it makes it a little bit easier for the users to identify what forms go together. Now I'm going to go down to this bottom form that's called Smart Controls Demo Form, and I'm going to create a new record. So like I just mentioned, this is a brand new record, and already I have all of these fields pre-populated so that my user doesn't have to put that information in. So the first 4 that I have up there are display, username, first name, last name, and email, as well an email. Those 4 are iFormBuilder built-in functions. To show you a little bit of what that looks like, I'm just going to bring over my form builder on the other half of the screen. So for the display username at the very top of the smart controls and the dynamic values, you'll notice I have iFormBuilder.username. So that's what's pre-populating that read-only field. Underneath, I have iFormBuilder.firstname. Then I have iFormBuilder.lastname. And the display email, which is the iFormBuilder email. So like I mentioned, those are all built-in functions, and those are things that normally the user may have to put in by themselves, and now they don't have to because I've already put that in for them. Underneath those fields, I use the social security number element to gather the information from the user about their birth date. Now, the reason I did that is because a lot of times, well, I would say most of us, I wouldn't say everybody on this call, but most of us, we're not born 10, 15 years ago. So if we're using the date widget, then we have to scroll through that Rolodex for a long period of time. So to make it easier, I use the social security number widget, as well as I set the mask and the keyboard. So if I go into the date of birth, and then I can just start putting in my numbers, and there we go. What you'll also notice is that underneath where I put my birth date, I concatenated 3 elements together. So I have the first name, last name, as well as the birth date, all in one line. Now that could be very helpful for my data collection, and that's why I've done that. What that looks like in the smart controls is I have what I call squiggly brackets, display underscore first name. So that was the data column name of the first element that was capturing the user's first name. From there, I have the last name, data column name, and then the date of birth data column name for the element right above. Now, I'm not going to go back and forth to show you how I did all of those. I will show you after, but instead I want to just show you a little bit more about the form. So beneath that first section, I used my client validation. So the question here is just next scheduled visit. So if I were to select today and try to submit this form, I'll end up receiving an error message. And this error message will tell me that I have to choose a date in the future. So please enter a future date. So I'll have to go back up to that form field and select, maybe tomorrow. But I could also select, any month. So we'll do August 22nd, 2015. Now what I've done in the element underneath that is I want the user to know even after whatever their next scheduled visit is, 3 months after that, they have to go back. So I wanted to pre-populate a date 3 months off of the date that they select here. So I can show that to them as well. The next section I have is to show an element based off of a user's input. So the question just simply, was there any broken equipment in the lab? If they say not applicable, nothing shows up. If they say no, nothing shows up. If they select yes, then you'll notice that 3 fields show up. It asks what was broken. So I'll just say the chair. And then underneath that, it says, does the chair need to be replaced or repaired? So I use the dynamic label to change the text in this question to include the answer that was previously put in by the user. Say replace or repair, that's fine. And then underneath that, it says send email to. I've defaulted this email widget to be my email address. So if you wanted to default it to a specific email only if they had any broken equipment, then you'd want to set your form up like this to hide that element unless they selected that there was something that was broken. So the next part of this form, we use what we call smart option lists. The way this works is based off of what I select here, will change what is selected in the what type pick list underneath. So if I select lift, then it'll show me arms, legs, and other. If I go back and I select speed and agility, it shows me jump, skip, hand-eye coordination, or other. So I'm just going to choose hand-eye coordination here and select. And beneath that, I've used some other built-in functions that we have called ZZ Display Value and ZZ Display Key. Now what those do is they show the label for the option as well as the key value for an option that was selected in an option list. Now this is only important if you're if you want to see the label in the feeds, or if you wanted to see the label or the key value if you're trying to integrate with an internal system. So that's just something to think about as well.
Berit, we have a couple questions when you're ready for them.
Oh, sure. Great. Right now would be great.
Sounds good. So can you just go over again the some examples? Like let's say you have driver's license in different formats and want to parse information based on different styles. Is that something that's feasible? And then the other question was just on styling the forms and branding and logos and sorts.
Sure. So going with the first one and parsing out the driver's license data, that is definitely something that you can do. In a few moments, I'll actually be showing you, I'll do a barcode scan and just show you kind of what that looks like. With the license, we have documentation and I can send this to you later if LA gets your name. But the way that works is you're able to identify what fields you want displayed, as well as when you create your form, you're able to identify what barcode readers that you want to be used. So if there's different types of barcodes on the different kinds of licenses that you're looking at, then you can select each one of those types. And based off of that scan, when you're going through the process, those should all be accepted because you've checked those off within the barcode scanning. Again, with parsing out that data, what you'll want to do is we'll send you the documentation on how it looks and everything like that. But if you're trying to gain different information from different licenses, then you'll have to set that up accordingly. And again, we can talk you through that at a later time if that's needed. As far as branding each form and if you wanted to add images and logos, that is very easy to do. If you go to the Edit Form Properties page, and I'll just go back here. So this is going, by pressing that Edit button, it brings me to the beginning screen that you always see when you're creating a form, but the Edit Form Properties page. At the end of the Edit Form Properties page, before the page level JavaScript, you see a section that says Label Icons URL. So here I've hosted some of my pictures within a Dropbox folder called iFormPics. Since I've set that up and I've connected my Dropbox account to iFormBuilder, then I'm able to use images within my form. And the way that I have to do that is I need to make sure that my data column name, what's here, is the name of the picture in that Dropbox folder.
One more question about JavaScript and dynamic controls. Do you need to enter the same JavaScript and the same syntax as normal JavaScript?
That's a great question. It is, we do use basic JavaScript. What you need to remember is that you'll use the data column names as the elements. So it is very similar to regular syntax of JavaScript. I mean, we still use the squiggly brackets. If you want to do more dynamic JavaScript, then you can go into the Edit Form Properties page again and do the page level JavaScript, and you can see here that I've used that regular syntax as well. And then you just call to that specific variable within the form. And that's getting a little bit more advanced.
Sounds good, thanks. And it sounds like the audio is almost getting worse for some people. I'm not sure. Maybe it's our internet today.
I think
I'm
it's
not
our
sure if you have like
internet.
another headset.
I think you're cutting in and out too, Elahe. So I'm very, very sorry about everybody and our internet connection today. Hopefully it gets a little bit better and not worse as we continue. And Elahe, if you wouldn't mind just asking Amol about it, that would be helpful too.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so going on, the next thing that I wanted to show to you was how to do some kind of calculation, or just show you what it looks like on the form stance. So here I have a subform that I want to do some kind of calculation with. So maybe I am just doing inventory and I see that there's 5 sweatshirts, 7 jeans, and whatever it may be. And I want to add those numbers together. So very simply right now, I'm just going to put in some of these numbers. And at the very bottom, you'll notice that I'm already doing a calculation. So I'm doing my addition, subtraction, and multiplication. So I'm going to press done here. And I'm going to create another record. The reason for that being is not only am I doing calculations here, but I'm going to aggregate those totals on the parent form. So I've done 2 records. I'm going to go back to the parent form. And you'll notice now that I have subform aggregation addition and subform aggregation average. So it's taken those 2 records and it's created the sum as well as the average together. Now underneath that, I've done 2 different functions using our third-party app widget. So these are, and I'm just going to scroll down into my form to show you that. So within the input properties, I've used the iOS URL scheme and I've placed a phone number. Now based off of that phone number, once I tap this element, it's going to launch my SMS system, and at that point I can start sending a message to my supervisor. Now I have to go back into iForm, but the other one that I have is to launch the maps. So this is I've placed in a specific location. So in the Google Maps, and if I scroll down a little bit here, you'll notice that I have name value pairs. So this is the actual location coordinates for this specific point. So if there was always the same point that someone was going to for this form, then this would be really helpful to kind of show them that route, as well as if you have internet connection, they would be able to get directions to that place. This is also really helpful if you have a specific form that you're using for an event or something, and you want to show your users how to get to a certain location. I'm going to go back into iForm. And the next thing that I want to show you is I'm going to use the location widget, and I'm going to parse out the latitude and longitude. And then based off of that latitude and longitude, I'm actually going to create a URL. This URL is then clickable if you're using the HTML email alerts from iForm. So the first thing I do is I go in that location widget, I gather my location details. Underneath that, you'll notice I have sections called latitude and longitude coordinates. These 3, and maybe even all 4 of these elements, I would hide from the user's view, and I would do that by placing false in the condition value. But I wanted to show you here what's actually happening. So I've taken this information, the user's location, and in my smart controls, I call to the data column name, so that's location of user, and then I just did dot latitude. And all that's doing is giving me the latitude information for the location. Then I did the same thing for longitude. Beneath that, I've said, using the data column names, I said latitude, space, comma, longitude coordinates. So those are the data column names. And all that's doing is concatenating those 2 fields together in the format that I need to have it set up as for my URL that I want created. And then all I did for that bottom one is I've used the beginning of that HTTP, and then I added the lat long. So again, I would hide that from my user, but I wanted to show you that process. And then the final part that I have in this form is going to use the barcode scanner. So Manatee Works is a great tool, and it's a great asset that iFormBuilder has, because Manatee Works allows you as a user to create different barcodes and be able to read different barcodes. One thing to keep in mind when you're using this is you'll have to download the Manatee Works free app to have it call to it from iForm. So now I'm just going to tap to scan, and it's going to open up the Manatee Works barcode reader. And now that it was done scanning, it brought back the individual's name, their email address, the company URL, and the state. At this point, if I wanted to add additional notes or participant's picture, I could. I could then press done, or if there's someone else, if I had another barcode, I would just tap that element again, and then I could scan someone else's details. So, I mean, if you look at this form, there's actually a lot of data that I'm collecting, but I've pre-populated and defaulted so many different elements here that it makes the user's experience a lot simpler and a lot faster. That way, like I mentioned earlier, they'll be able to collect more data while they're in the field. Now this is only so helpful. It's, I think, more helpful if I show you how I did it. So I'm going to go back to my form builder. So I kind of walked you through some of this already. The ZZ display values, what I did there is, like I mentioned earlier, that is a built-in function. And I just did underscore and used the data column name that was used for that pick list. So you'll notice there's a lot of repetition with how this is created, and that data column name is key to making any of this JavaScript work. So earlier in the call, I also mentioned that I have all these different links for you to have access to once this session is over. All of these are just different help desk articles that you'll be able to click on to learn more, but as well as us going through some of it now. So to start with some of these overview of the smart controls, I already mentioned that you'll want to use the data column name. Also, if you have more in-depth JavaScript functions, then you want to use the page level JavaScript. For those of you who are building forms and you have a dedicated database and you plan on sharing that form between dedicated databases, you may want to think about, or if you plan on copying that form into those dedicated databases, you may want to think about trying to put a lot of your code and script in the page level JavaScript. And I can talk to you more about that at another time, but just wanted to point that out as well. These other pieces at the bottom, this is really, I guess, the best way if you're brand new to using JavaScript. This is the best way to start thinking about the processes. So you have the ampersands together, that's and. You can also do or functions. If you have the two equal signs together, that always symbolizes that something is equal to something else. And again, false in the conditional value will hide the element from view for the device. And number widget, and you always want to default it to 4. Here, my example, I have that it's defaulted to 0, but you could change that, of course, and you just have the data column name equals and whatever number you want it to. You could also use the squiggly brackets and place in that number within the squiggly brackets. Here's a list of different elements that you can default and some examples. So earlier somebody asked about using basic JavaScript statements and syntax. It is very, very similar. You have the new date, and then if you are, this is another thing that just kind of keep in mind too, if you're using any kind of text or you want to default to any kind of text, within the squiggly brackets, you'll use the quotes. Now, with the birth date, I did show you how I had updated the mask to only show the amount of numbers that I wanted for the month, date, and year. But you also have the option to customize that mask even more so. So if you don't want to just have it be numerical input and you want to allow for character alpha characters and numerical characters, then you can by doing capital A. Here are some other options that you can do to default that mask. Now that's not so much within the dynamic value, but like I mentioned, or like I showed, and I'm happy to do that again here, this is in the input properties. So you can update that mask right in that section, but you also have the option to change the keyboard. So if the social security number was going to the defaulting to the alpha keyboard and you didn't really want that, like I didn't really want that, so I updated it to point to the number and punctuation. Now I have both of these on the same page, so the basic math functions and the concatenation. The reason I have these listed on the same page is because it comes with the same idea and the same premise on how you set it up. You're using the data column name, you're using the plus sign, and you're using squiggly brackets. So within another field, you'll want to, with the squiggly brackets, you'll call to the different data column names that you want concatenated together, or the numbers that you want concatenated or added or subtracted together. So in this example, I have a display first name plus, and then you'll notice that I have quotes and a space. The reason, as you can imagine, is I don't want the first and last name to be bumping into each other and read as one line. I want them to be separated. So I've added the quotes in between, and then I've also added quotes and comma in between the last name and birth date. So it's pretty simple when you think about it, just taking in the data column names from those things, those different elements, and then adding them together. The dynamic label is also relatively simple to think about. It's again using that data column name and any text that you want to add. So again, keep in mind that whenever you're using text within the dynamic values, the labels, or the conditional values, you always have quotes around that text. With the client validation, this is where you're able to create the specific requirement for the user and essentially not allow them to go past go unless they meet that requirement. Please notice too that I have the number listed in front of this. The reason for that being is I had that set as a date element, and for that I needed to add number within that calculation. Another part of that process is I wanted to show to the user a date in 3 months. So again, I use the date element, but I have next scheduled visit date, which is referring to this element right above, and then just the set month, next scheduled visit, again referring to that data column name, get month, and then add 3 to it. So it's taking that date and then going 3 months in advance. If this is a little bit too much and you're kind of confused by that, I'd be happy to slow it down or answer any questions. But LHA has it seem to be going on your end. So then moving forward, adding smart controls to option list is something that a lot of our folks are able to do and pick it up relatively easy. So if you're not doing it yet, that's okay, but it's just so easy that you should start. The first reason that you'd probably want to show this, or where it really comes up, is a lot of times you'll create option lists and maybe it's not so black and white, and you may have to allow the user to add an other option. So what I usually do is I have an other field within that pick list, and then underneath it I have a text area that they can fill in with the specifics for the other. So in this example here, I actually had this question set up a little bit differently, where I used the data column name of the option list in the beginning of that condition value. Then I use equals equals, and then whatever index value that option is within that option list. So if you're not aware of what I'm talking about when I say index value, if I go into this option list and the option list manager, if I go to advanced, then you'll notice on the left-hand side, each one of these options has a number. That's called an index value, and it always starts with 0. And that's why in my condition value statement, I set it so that the text area will only show up if that 0 is selected, which is the yes. You can also set it up so that you have a segmented or smart option list. The example that I had earlier about the exercise, what muscle group were you using, based off of that, it would show what exercise types that you would do. But there's even better examples out there. For some groups, it could be selecting a species, and then based off of that species, then selecting an animal. So there's different options with that. The way that that's done is by going into the condition value in the advanced section. This is where you do this on the second option list, and you call to the first option list. So the same way that we had to call to the option list in the condition value to show an element, you have to do the same thing here to show these different options within the option list. So in my example, I'll just open that again. In the advanced section, I say the type of exercise, which is the previous data column name. If the user selects the first one, equals 0, then show these 4 options. If they select the second one, then show these options. And that could go on and on as long as your list went. Another reason people will do that is they'll maybe have their user first select a state, and then based off of the state they select, they would show a facility. Then we have the ZZ value and the ZZ key. I briefly mentioned that earlier, why you would use that, and I did show that to you. But the main reason I find it extremely helpful is if I'm trying to use either the label text from the user's selection in another question, or if I'm trying to use it for a smart table search, I'll use the ZZ display value to have that created. Now going forward, the location widget. This is where I was able to parse out that data, and now I'm actually going to go back into that smart control and place in false so that I can hide that from the user. But again, it's that data column name of the location widget in latitude, longitude, and then I concatenated those 2 fields and created the URL. And the last thing is just with the barcode scanning. Oops. And if I scroll up here, so when I set this up, I have my scan the user's badge. So I already knew what kind of scans I was going to do. But like the question earlier, someone said, well, you know, licenses may have different barcode scans. So I could, if I wanted to, I could check off all these different symbologies, even if I wasn't sure. So I would check off all of those. The next thing that I have to do in my ManityWorks input type is I have to select the effort level. So the way the effort level works is depending on how strong your camera is and the focus, the higher the level, the higher it's going to try to zone in on what the barcode is, and the longer it may take. Then what I have underneath there is I have my Manity text element to pass data to. So this is actually what I created to see the raw data. Now with the licensing, you don't have to see the raw data, and you don't need to because of the text, that the way that the licenses are broken up. But for other kind of barcodes, you will need to look at the raw data to kind of get an idea on how you want to parse the information out afterward. So when I first set this up, I didn't have false in the condition value because I needed to see how it was broken up and how the data looked. Based off of what I found, I created read-only elements, and I started with my Manity widget, which is the data column name of the Manity widget. I have .raw.split, and basically what this is saying, from where it says on to where it says email, show me that information. And then going forward, where it has email type to URL, show me what's in between those pieces. And that continues for all the elements that I have underneath. So that's how I was able to parse out and read that barcode without having to look at without the user having to look at the raw data. So if you are brand new to using barcode scanning, the first step really is to see what the raw data looks like, and then based off of what you see, parse it out from there. And very simply, it's just I had raw.split, and then I placed whatever was in between. Elhe, are there any questions?
We have a couple. Can you give an example of, again, of how to use a smart table search?
Sure. So the smart table search is awesome. What you're able to do is based off of the user's input of a unique identification. So whether it's their name or their username or specific location, or even what if they choose something specifically from a pick list, based off of that unique identifier, you can pre-populate form fields. So the same way that I use those built-in functions from iFormBuilder, you can pre-populate, maybe if a user selects a location of where an inspection needs to take place. Based off of what they select there, it can show the address, the phone number, who the supervisor is, and any other fields that you want pre-populated. It'll be pre-populated by data that was either already collected within an iFormBuilder form, or if you already have that stored in your database, you can upload it as a CSV file to iFormBuilder, and that way the user doesn't have to put in that information again and again and again because you already have it. All right, so we're actually getting towards the end of this session. So I briefly talked to you about the different built-in functions that we have. So these are the 4 that I had at the top of my form. But then I also showed you how the iFormBuilder.math.sum, the subform aggregation worked. And this kind of breaks it down even more so with what you'd place in the dynamic value for each of those fields. And then we have the third-party app widget. I showed you how the SMS worked and the maps, but you could also do a phone call, FaceTime, Google Drive, and so many more. What you have to keep in mind, though, is depending on the device that your user has access to, if it's iOS or Android, or if they could be using either or, then you'll want to make sure you put in the URL scheme for both the iOS and the Android devices. So here are some other links to help you get started and really start making your forms even more dynamic and cutting down your time on data cleansing. So we have just how to pass data from the parent form element to a subform or vice versa, how to start using some of those reference IDs, the smart table search so you can use that to work on that process. Just different ways to integrate with hardware. We have a couple different hardwares that we're currently integrating with, but we're always looking for others, so if you have any recommendations. How to start using the Esri widget, the Manatee works for barcode scanning, how to assign a post URL, which is even, it's a great functionality that we have, and it's going to be on our next training webinar, we're going to talk about doing some integration. And so I strongly suggest you sign up for that one if you haven't yet. But how to select a keyboard type and then the form menu updates. And the last thing that I want to share with you here is just that you are not alone. We are here to help. We have an amazing customer success center that you should sign up for. So if you haven't signed up yet, it can be a little bit confusing when you get started. So just click the sign in button, and then at the bottom of the sign in button, you'll see an area that says new to iFormBuilder Zendesk sign up. So you should definitely do that. You also have the option to chat with an agent. So if you have any questions, be sure to follow our release notes so that you can get even more information about when releases are happening. And like I shared with you earlier about the release 8.0 that's coming out on the 28th. We have our community forum. We love to have people interact with each other. We found that our most popular one is the vote for features. And through the vote for features, you're able to kind of really dictate what's coming next for iFormBuilder. So if you have any free time, go in there and just give some upvotes to other things that you want to see happen within iFormBuilder. And the last two, we do offer implementation support. We love to help you build your forms. We love to go on site to do training. We love to just help you build out your workflow. So let us know what we can do for you. And that's about it. So if there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank you guys for taking the time out today. And in the next 24 hours, we'll be sending you the PDF as well as the recording.